Hello? None of my past students would ever say that you could not hear me. Honestly, that is like my forte of you can be downstairs in the restroom and still continue on with my classes. But I never spoke this in a big auditorium. So good evening. We're ready for the afternoon part of the program. Thank you all for sticking around and enjoying, if it's enjoyable, what you hear, but the conversation is what's enjoyable. At this time, it is my honor to introduce to you Dr. Michael Washington, professor at Kentucky State University, Northern Kentucky University. When I got his pages and pages and pages of things I was supposed to read over and introduce him, I thought about the fact that I would have former students in the audience. And the first thing they would tell me, because they always critique me very well, is Ms. James, you shouldn't have read all of that. So I am not going to read all of that, all right? I'm not even going to give you a summary. But what I am going to do is let you be aware of the fact of some of his credentials. Dr. Michael H. Washington, professor at Northern Kentucky University, received his doctoral degree from the University of Cincinnati, his master's from the University of Cincinnati, and his undergraduate from the University of Cincinnati. Dr. Washington's work focuses on the African American experience, and he has published several monographs and dozens of articles in anthologies, journals, and encyclopedias. His international experiences consist of speaking engagements and research both in Southern Africa and in Japan. He has received both the Malone 1991 and the Fulbright in 2001 fellowship. As a Malone Fellow, he studied Arab history, culture, politics, and religion at the American University at Cairo in Egypt, Abu Dhabi, and Qatar. As a Fulbright Fellow, he was invited to teach at a women's university in Tokyo, in Japan. His experience, as you can tell, has led him to teach abroad, and that is just one of the many accolades that he holds to his name. Since 1995, he has been a professor of history at Northern Kentucky University, where he founded the Black Studies program. I give to you Dr. Michael Washington, and I hope I did not mess it up.
Thank you. Thank you for the magnificent introduction. Folks, I'm here really to facilitate the questions and answers for the panel. So I don't have that much more to share. In fact, I'm here to be a student of the people who talked this morning. I thought that the talks were very diverse and very thorough and very good. And my job is to get questions from the audience. I'm particularly interested in the youth in the back, who, when I was a youth, I've never even heard the word lynching before. And it was happening all around. So I'm interested to hear what their questions might be. Some things that were said about how lynchings affected the family, adults and children, even children were lynched. So my job today is to elicit questions from the audience. And we have a microphone right here, so if you have a hard time speaking up, just walk up to the microphone and give the panelists a question. You can even ask me a question. You can even ask a question about this auditorium. We have experts on this panel. I can tell you about that. So who's going to be the brave soul to come forth? Okay, Mr. Bailey. Come on up, Mr. Bailey. Give us your first question. Your students love you.
Okay. Maybe in what ways was the Harlem Renaissance a response to racial violence? in what ways was the Harlem Renaissance a response to racial violence at the time?
Did everyone hear that? In what ways was the Harlem Renaissance, this is 1920s, in what ways was the 1920s the rebirth in the culture, African American culture, and the mainstreaming of African American culture? In what ways was that a response to lynching? Anybody want to comment on that?
So good afternoon again. Mr. Daly is one of my former students. I'm very, very proud of him. I haven't seen him in a while, but he's doing quite well. About the Harlem Renaissance, the two things people need to know. There was the Harlem Renaissance, but then there's also the Chicago Renaissance in the 1930s, in the 1940s. And it's about people who had moved to Harlem, who later moved to Chicago. It's about migration, but also immigration, because many of the people you can talk about during the Harlem Renaissance, they were black, but they were not born on these shores. So that expands, number one, the immigration story away from Europeans coming from Ireland, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, Western Europe, wherever. Some of these people are coming from Africa and the Caribbean as well. And so part of that story is they're escaping economic marginalization and racial violence in predominantly black spaces outside of the United States. But then you also have people who are migrating from the southern United States. And the Harlem Renaissance is a time where there's this proliferation of art, talent, writing, literature, photography, so on and so forth. But it's also an opportunity for people to find themselves in a space where, even if you're still living in segregated New York, and New York is segregated, many black people were concentrated in Harlem and places like that. You wouldn't know that to go to Harlem in the 21st century, but that's the way it was once upon a time. But it was because they wanted to realize greater economic opportunities without being killed. They wanted to be able to exercise the right to vote without being killed. But then they also wanted to demonstrate everything that was rich and robust about the culture of African descendant people. And I'm intentionally saying African descendant because, again, many of these people come from different parts of the African diaspora. It is indeed a concentrated effort and successfully done to demonstrate all that black people have contributed to the United States, but also to the world.
There was a huge response in the South to violence, and moving away was a big part of it, but it wasn't all to New York. As a matter of fact, for Arkansas African Americans, they often went to Chicago, St. Louis, and then of course cities in Michigan. In 1927, there was a horrendous lynching in Little Rock, which disintegrated into, and this, it could have done this in Malvern, but it didn't. The lynching in Little Rock in 1927 disintegrated into an attack on a major black community close to downtown Little Rock. One of the families that lived there was the family of the first female black composer in America to be widely recognized. Her name was Florence Price. The Price family was a really significant family in Little Rock. Her husband was a lawyer, Thomas. Her father was a dentist and an artist who showed at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. A very significant family in Little Rock. After that 27 riot and the lynching and the violence in the city, they moved to Chicago. So instead of her symphony being performed by the Arkansas Symphony, it was performed, the first symphonic composition performed in America by a black composer was Florence Price from Chicago, who should have been from Little Rock. but that lynching drove that family away. And just think about all those families, what resources we lost. And it wasn't just the Harlem Renaissance, but it was in many places all over the country.
I want to add to that as well. Another part of the reaction during this period that many refer to as the Harlem Renaissance was the increased activism of African American organizations. So, of course, we're talking about the NAACP, which by the 1920s had been around for a few years, but we're also talking about organizations like the National Association of Colored Women, which still exists to this day. On a state level, organizations like the Arkansas Association of Colored Women, which still exists to this day. So there are reactions both inside and outside of Arkansas. Also, Black people are forming organizations, all kinds of civil rights organizations in reaction to lynching, racial violence, discrimination, voter fraud, so on and so forth. And we tend to think about civil rights organizations as only being the NAACP, but there are organizations before the NAACP and there are organizations after the NAACP that reacted to a wide range of injustices facing African Americans.
Real good. I know that I'm the moderator, but can I have something to say about that? Okay. In 1919, there was a poet whose name was Claude McKay, who had come from Jamaica. And his poem was really considered the poem that sparked the literature and the poetry of the Harlem Renaissance. And it was about the lynching. It was specifically to address lynching. So it was called If We Must Die. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in glorious spots, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mark at our accursed lot. If we must die, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood will not be shed in vain. Then, even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, let us meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave. What though before us lies the open grave? Claude McKay, folks. Any other questions? We have some students coming up, folks. It's wonderful.
My question is, how were Black people in America affected during the Great Depression?
Let me see if I got the question right. How were Black people affected during the Great Depression?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm trying to give Guy a chance. He hasn't said anything yet. You ever heard this saying that if it rains on America, it storms on Black America? That's what the Great Depression was like for African Americans. Racial violence increases, job competition increases. During the 1930s, that there's a Scottsboro case down in Alabama. African American migration increases, but also at the very same time, you have increased Black political activism. Additional civil rights organizations were founded during the 1930s. African American women's organizations are increasing their activism, helping African Americans think very seriously about exercising the right to vote, dangerous though it was. And I can also speak to what's happening in rural spaces, right? African Americans are working, for example, for the Arkansas Agricultural Extension Service. We want to make this local. And some of these folks are farm agents, some of these women are some of these folks are home demonstration agents that are segregated. The Cooperative Extension Service was segregated until the 1960s, but these people are working in rural Black communities in the 1930s because they know that poor Black people are dealing with housing insecurity, food insecurity, health insecurity, so on and so forth. And so they had these people gathering at these meetings, which were often predominantly African American schools or predominantly African American churches, and they're having discussions about how to navigate life in the Great Depression, where black people tend to be among the poorest of the poor. I don't think you could get much poorer than what many black people were during the Great Depression, but they're talking to them about ways to survive the Great Depression. And so many of these discussions in home demonstration clubs, for instance, I've told people in other settings that despite the fact that some say, well, they were just sitting around canning tomatoes, canning tomatoes ain't all that interesting. So they're having other discussions about how to survive the Great Depression and how to access rights and how to challenge racial violence and the like. So political activism during this period is not just about casting a ballot, it's having these conversations about what you're entitled to. I would even consider it a sort of preparation for the moment when you can actually exercise the right to vote or become involved in some other way. So it's not a period where black people are stagnant. I'll say this once again, we're not just talking about black trauma during these moments, we're also talking about black organizing, black resistance, and black activism.
The New Deal, the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration was elected in 1932 in large measure because of the severe economic downturn in the economy. America was on its knees, and of course the black population was even worse off than the white population, which is saying a lot. But while the New Deal was an effort to bring relief that was not limited just to white people, the administration did allow, for example, for black participation in CCC activities, the Civilian Conservation Corps. So we had in Arkansas black camps of black enrollees who did public works. One I can think of is there was a CCC camp for black enrollees somewhere on the lower Arkansas, and they worked off and they lived on boats, and they did conservation work along rivers. And the point of that is that the New Deal adopted a lot of social programs which did have a positive impact, including on black Americans, but it was not as pronounced as the impact that it had on white Americans, for sure.
Any other questions?
I was about to say, I drove 176 miles to get here. I need y'all to ask some questions.
I've got really two questions. One of them is for Dr. Lancaster, and the other one is for...
Will you speak into the microphone?
Closer to the mic.
All right, the question that I have, in your presentation, we had... In your presentation, Dr. Lancaster, you took it off in kind of a political bent, talking about Trump's use of the words lynching and witch hunt and so forth. The question I have for you is, would you consider the political impeachments of Donald Trump to be considered a form of lynching? And for Mitchell, the question that I've got for you, in the discussion we've had in the beginning of this thing, I mean, the lynching involved dragging a man out from somewhere. Lynching involved a totally uncalled for episode and killing of a man in totally inappropriate fashion. And yet, all these high-profile deaths events, lynching, compared to what the discussion of the day referred to.
Can everybody hear me? First off, I had thought I made myself clear. I don't consider the impeachment a lynching. I think that is an exaggerated or almost perverse use of the word. And I realize it was used, I think it was Joe Biden, he was the senator at the time, used it to describe the impeachment of Bill Clinton. And, I think that was wrong too. I would like to address the issue of criminality, because as Dr. Jones Branch put up, that list of causes for lynching, ostensible causes, alleged crimes that many of these people had done. Some of them were scaring a woman. Well, I mean, a large black man can scare a small white woman just by being there. Some of the ones I've researched, there are no stated causes whatsoever. We just hear that there is a lynching that occurred. Something like allegedly stealing money out of a till. There was a case in Stone County, I want to say in 1897. A young black child was lynched. He had been accused of taking money from a shop owner. And so the shop owner and several men took him out into the woods and strung him up by his neck to urge him to confess. They let him down. He wouldn't confess. They strung him up again. Tell him to confess, let him down. He wouldn't confess. They strung him up a third time. Said, if you don't confess, we're going to shoot you. They let him down. And the newspapers described him making some gurgling sounds that they took to be a confession, and so they left him alone. Some newspapers say in a dying state. The crime and the punishment, the lynching, are often tremendously mismatched. There are cases where, someone is lynched on the basis of testimony from a 5-year-old, for example. If any of you have children, you know how difficult it can be communicating clear ideas and receiving clear ideas from children as to what happened. To tie that in today, if you look at cases like Eric Garner, okay, he was selling loose cigarettes. I don't think the punishment for selling loose cigarettes needs to be slowly being strangled to death, in a painful position, unable to breathe. I mean, the punishment for loose cigarettes is at most a fine or, a brief term in jail. So, when we think of lynching as something that is the result of the crime, we often need to be aware of the mismatch between the crime and punishment, and also how often the crime is assumed rather than proved. To give one more example, in 1892, a man named Ed Coy was burned to death in Texarkana, Arkansas. He was tied to a cedar stake, doused with oil, and set on fire for the alleged crime of raping a white woman, the wife of a man named Henry Jewell. Well, later investigation revealed it was very likely Ed Coy had been having a consensual affair with Mrs. Jewell. In fact, one report from the scene, because she was brought to identify him and also to essentially light the match. When they had him tied up and doused in oil, they brought her forward with a torch to set him on fire, and he apparently said to her, "Are you going to do this to me, babe?" that we know, and actually we know that there were a number of black men lynched for consensual relationships. There was one man, Drew County, I think it was. The headline of the newspaper that described his lynchings was "Lynched for eloping." They didn't even bother to accuse him of rape. They acknowledged openly that he had been lynched for eloping with a white girl, and that's not the only case. So, you know, lynching is something that occurs independent of crime, not because of crime.
Yes. The question was a very good question. You know, in our society today, we see police officers, and not only police officers, but just citizens of the general populace, taking the law in their own hands and administering prescribed judgment for a crime perceived or one that actually happened. But the situation is like this. If you look at the definition of lynching, it'll tell you that it is an act of violence committed to a person without a trial or a jury, or someone just choosing to take the law into their own hands and administering what they believe to be justice. In our society today, we don't see, or very seldom see, white policemen shooting white citizens. We don't see black policemen shooting black citizens, white citizens. But what we see is that any infraction, including a broken tail light, and somebody gets shot 7 times. I mean, it's ridiculous, and I don't have the answers as to why that's happening. All I know is that it is happening. And if you look at the definition of lynching, you will find that this act actually fits the definition of lynching. Now, I know that I'm not trying to say, or never would I say, that every act that happens in this sense was a lynching, or that the perpetrator didn't maybe cause that to happen. Maybe. I'm not trying to say that. But I'm just trying to say that the act itself somewhat fit the definition of a lynching.
I think many white people, I think many African Americans would be offended and are offended to see things described as lynchings when they're just political discussions. That trivializes lynching. It's just not appropriate. Lynching should be reserved, that word should be reserved for what it was, which was murdering people in a specific sort of way. And it has nothing to do with Donald Trump being lynched.
Clarence Thomas tried to invoke that concept, and he became the Chief Justice of the United States. Because it was such a powerful concept, even the white liberals stood back because they didn't want to be associated with the lynching of a black man. Give us some more questions, folks. This is wonderful. Come right up. Let the student come up too.
While she's coming up here, I would like to point out that lynching is quite complicated in some ways. For example, it wasn't just African American victims, there were white victims, there were men and women, there were, as he pointed out, children. They were not, no two of them set exactly the same pattern. The worst lynching I've ever heard of was up in Mississippi County, where they burned, what was his name, Henry something or other. They announced it in the Memphis newspaper that they would be having the lynching, tomorrow at such and such a time. And no one in law enforcement came out to stop that. So lynching takes many, many forms, but it involves killing people.
And let's also be clear, once again, when we talk about lynching, we're talking about it as if it's something that only happens to men, right? And as my colleague has said, lynching involves a wide range of racial violence for things perceived as crimes. But I'm hard-pressed to understand that when a black woman is lynched and was raped beforehand, you would be very hard-pressed to convince me that she committed some crime that justified her being raped and then lynched.
It's kind of hard to imagine the heinousness of a lynching. And just like my compatriot here says that women were lynched too. And that was one occasion in Georgia where there was a dispute between a storekeeper and a guy named Hayes Turner. I think Hayes Turner was, he was not happy with the price that he was being paid for his cut or whatever else, whatever it was that he was selling. For his challenge of the store owner, he was lynched and burned. But that's not the worst of it all. His wife went to the authorities on the very next day to complain and to press charge, and maybe to bring charges against the people who had committed the crime. For that, she was hung by her feet, doused with gasoline, set on fire. Now, Mary was 8 months pregnant, and they cut the baby out of her stomach and stomped it to death. Now, I can't imagine anything more heinous than that, anything more animalistic than that. And these acts and acts that are similar are what I call lynchings. You know, like I say, I'm not trying to say that everything that happened in that regard, that the perpetrator was innocent. But I'm saying that if you are accused of a crime, I believe that you deserve a jury trial. I don't believe that I have the prerogative to say that you are guilty or that you deserve death, pull out my gun and shoot you. You know, and it's sort of like slavery. And I tell all of my friends about slavery, the only reason that we ever had slavery was because you couldn't be a slave. Now, if you could have been a slave, we wouldn't have had slavery. We would have had armed revolution. We wouldn't have had protests and things like that. We would have had armed revolution because it would not been allowed to have happened. But we had no defenses. Like the man said, it's hard to hide when you're black. It's sort of like a piece of pepper in a salt factory. It's kind of hard, you know, we couldn't get away, and we were actually confined here. But lynching is lynching. It's lynching. And I see it that way, and I know that it might be a personal thing, but that is how I see it. Thank you for your listening.
Go ahead, Susan.
No.
2020, the stats showed 2020 stats show that African Americans hold the highest rate for incarceration. Do you believe that it is equivalent to slavery or like death row and the death penalty, like police brutality? Do you believe that's equivalent to lynching?
Her question, before she goes back, I want to make sure I say it right. She says, do we believe that in 2020, now that they have the high incarceration rates of African American youth, is that equivalent to slavery and punishment like lynching?
Do you believe the death penalty? Do you believe the death penalty is equivalent to, like, the lynchings?
I can start with the death penalty. In 1909, the state of Arkansas passed Act 258, which was an act that was designed to reduce lynchings in the state, ostensibly. And what this act did was to allow for expedited trials of individuals who were accused of crimes that would, and I believe the law said, arouse popular spirit. That is, if there were fears of a lynch mob, a local judge could call in a special session, or the sheriff and local legal authorities could demand that the judge call a special session in order to carry out an expedited trial of the person involved. And they figured that carrying out these expedited trials would ameliorate things, would reduce the potential for mob violence, and thus reduce lynching. So the state of Arkansas itself saw incarceration and the death penalty because many of these people were accused of crimes that would have warranted the death penalty. Rape would have warranted the death penalty back then, and murder, obviously. The state of Arkansas saw the death penalty as something interchangeable with lynching. That will do it officially so that they don't lynch him unofficially. So, I mean, that's the state of Arkansas itself is testifying to that connection. As far as other aspects, the wealth gap and whatnot, one thing one has to understand is that there is previous scholars used to see Jim Crow segregation as something that may have minimized lynching, that as Jim Crow laws are passed, it's keeping black and white populations separate, and so minimizing the potential for conflict, and so minimizing lynching. Well, no. As Jim Crow laws start to be passed in the late 1880s, early 1890s, lynching actually goes up because the disempowerment of African Americans makes them, economically and politically makes them more vulnerable to the mob. So it's no accident that lynching goes up as segregation goes up. The economic and political disempowerment correlates to lynching. It's not a one-on-one exchange, but these things track in parallel.
Let me just make a point about the incarceration rate. She asked a question about 2020 African Americans are in prison. Well, when you study the history of Reconstruction and the Civil War, they point out that the 13th Amendment in 1865 ended slavery. But if you read it closely, it says, except when a person has been convicted of a crime, which means a person who's been convicted of a crime can be put back into slavery. So slavery did not cease to exist, but it ceased to exist as it was on the plantation and that sort of thing. So that at that moment in history, in 1865, the penitentiary replaced slavery as the basic institution of black oppression. Where else are you going to put these people? We brought them here to be the cheapest source of labor, slave labor. Now that that institution is over with, how will they now be accommodated into this world if they can't be slaves anymore? So that goes back to the Constitution.
And it's also about how to control black bodies. because that was pretty much a guarantee under the institution of slavery. You had laws, slave patrols, on and on and on. You can read about that kind of stuff, but once all that comes to a legal end, and the emphasis is on a legal end, how do you control these bodies? Well, you criminalize everything they do. And the thing that we have to think about is when we talk about, well, they committed a crime, who's deciding what a crime is and what a crime isn't? Vagrancy was a crime, right? You have too many black people standing around who aren't gainfully employed, that is, their bodies aren't laboring for white people or being controlled by white people. Somehow they're engaged in criminal activity, and so in some form or fashion, they have to be controlled. And while, yes, slavery comes to an end, those same bodies in the late 19th and early 20th century are incarcerated, but they're also being used to build towns, and they're also being used to use as agricultural labor. So there's a book by a well-known historian named Douglas Blackman, I think it is, and it's called Slavery by Another Name. That's all it is. It's just another effort to criminalize black bodies in order to control them, in order to coerce them into performing certain kinds of labor.
I would ask, would you conclude that lynching wasn't only perpetrated by hate, for hate reasons, but for profiteering? As if I am lynched, I'm a property owner, what happens to my property if I'm lynched? Would that property be considered as abandonment? And if it's an abandoned property, who would inherit that abandoned property?
Well, certainly, we know from Greenwood, Oklahoma, Tulsa, where the community was just obliterated, and that was due in large degree because they had a lot of property and they wanted it stolen. You know, we could steal property in lots of different ways. Remember that all those Japanese that were moved off the West Coast during World War II, their property was stolen from them. It's just incredible how things were taken from people. And today we hear a lot about, well, you know, black people used to own land, used to own farms, and now they don't. Lynching and other maintenance of the Jim Crow segregation system played out in many, many ways. And one of the ways it played out was by stealing the property of people who were oppressed.
Well, and my colleagues touched upon the work of Ida B. Wells, and one of the things that she documented was the theft of property following the Elaine massacre. There were women who were held in jail for long periods, came back and had found their houses emptied of all possessions, and could recognize their dishes, their towels, their whatever, visiting the homes of white people. So, often the chaos of a lynching or a riot is an opportunity to steal property.
Which suggests very clearly, once again, that we're not just talking about poor and impoverished black people in rural spaces. These are black people who had stuff and they own stuff. You don't steal nothing, all right? It's not because these people have committed crime. They were black and they were doing well. And that made people, as the young folks say, away. And so in order to make sure that they don't have anything, you kill them, you threaten them, you tell those who remain to leave town and never come back, and then you steal everything they own. It wasn't because these people weren't flourishing and weren't doing well. The exact opposite. If they were impoverished and didn't have anything, odds are they wouldn't even mess with these folks. A lot of times the people who are killed and run out of town are the people who are the movers and the shakers and the ones who are challenging stereotypes of black inferiority.
I need your help. We've talked a whole lot about the lynching victims, but as I've read about this, what I can't understand is what it would take to get a mob together that what the catalyst would be for any of the particular things. You got any suggestions?
The catalyst, that's the question. What's the catalyst?
We're hindered in this a little bit by virtue of the fact that we often don't know a whole lot about the mob itself. As in this particular case, they're described as quiet and orderly. We get a few glimpses of who exactly is part of the mob at times. There was a lynching in Jonesboro, Arkansas, a man nicknamed Bull Weevil, who had been accused of killing a cop. Mob surrounded the jail. The mayor of Jonesboro and the police chief had sequestered themselves in the jail and had actually armed themselves in order to, fire at the mob when the mob broke through. But the mayor later told his nephew that when the mob came through, he couldn't fire because the people he saw there were country club members, or church leaders, or business friends, that they were the cream of the crop of Jonesboro society. When you read about bodies being dragged behind cars, like John Carter, which Tom Dillard mentioned, the lynching of John Carter, it was a train of cars that was, there were dozens involved. Well, who had cars in 1927? It wasn't poor whites. The mobs are often, to the best of our knowledge, middle class or better. And so, as to the mentality, they're often regarding themselves as, I would say, defending their status, defending their wealth, defending their property against all challenges. Like I say, we're often hindered because, because we don't, mob members are consistently not identified in lynching reports. There was a white man named Lewis Allwhite lynched in Newport, Arkansas in 1904. And the mob of some 700 people attacked the jail at noon or so, took him outside of town and hanged him from a railroad trestle. And the coroner's report said death at the hands of persons unknown, which when that report hit the Arkansas Gazette, some wry editorialist commented that, we hear a lot about the death of humor these days, but it's not dead in Newport. They had a mob of 700 people whom nobody could identify marching down the Main Street in broad daylight. As to what motivates them, the level of planning and whatnot, sometimes there's a whole lot of planning, sometimes there's not. The lynching that occurred in Little Rock before John Carter, a man named Henry James, lynched in Little Rock in 1892. The mob is bumbling all over town and breaking up and splintering off because they can't find James because he was supposed to be at the city jail. Well, the mayor didn't want him there and have his nice city jail broken into, so he sent him to the county jail. Well, the county judge didn't want him there, sent him to the state pen. So you see this mob wandering through Little Rock, during the night. Parts of it are breaking off as people get tired. Parts of it are new members are arriving as the mob marches down. It's sort of very chaotic. So you shouldn't imagine that every mob has this singular vision. Sometimes it's just a whole lot of people bumbling around at night, and it becomes something to do. And that's something else that needs to be emphasized. There's a forthcoming book coming out in just a few days, actually, Lynching and Leisure by Terry Ann Scott. And what she does is examine lynching in the context of leisure activities at the time. This is an era, especially the late 19th, early 20th century, when people would go to see a legal execution. That was very common, going to see a legal execution. So there's actually a lot of overlap between lynching and other leisure activities. So.
I think we've got a microphone working here now.
As far as catalysts bringing this on, they're also different. I really don't know. But I think the thing that's underlying all of them is racism, just plain and simple racism, and what they're trying to do is defend the status quo, a system which takes care of white people at the expense of others. So I think that's the underlying thing that often served as a catalyst, was just real hate.
And can I say something else about
Can I
that?
go before you? I said, can I go before you?
No.
Thank you so much.
I want to say something else about this as well. Mob violence. When it occurs, we understand very well that it's done to send a message to black communities and to control black communities. But please understand, it's also designed to send a message to the white community as well. Because we don't want to assume that every white person gets caught up in this and says, I'm going to go kill some black people. There are always people who challenge this, but they have to also assess what it costs them to challenge that. How vocal do they want to be about that? Do they want to die a social death because they said this is wrong and you don't need to do that? So this works both ways. This is to control black communities and also to control white communities. I would also say that there's some sexual competition at play here too. Many of these lynchings of black men occur on the premise that they assaulted or did whatever to white women. I think with you, somebody made the point earlier that some of these relationships are consensual, but in some instances, some of these people have lied, right? So there are all these things that need to be taken into consideration that might draw these crowds into a frenzy. This idea about protecting the virtual white womanhood is not a new one, right? We really begin to see that develop in the 19th century, and it carries on way into the 20th century. And for many of these people, they see consensual relationships, they see black people who are doing well, who are prospering and thriving, and they can't deal with it. So they have to drum up an excuse to put an end to this. Now you may ask a question.
Well, I was going to add to that, and she took a lot of it. But what I was going to say is there's an aspect of socialization at play as well. So when you look at some of these images of lynchings that happen, you also see children there. And these children are learning something like Dr. Jones said as well. So this system is not new. When you look, we see it early on. So before slavery was ended, before the Civil War, and up until Jim Crow, there's still lessons that are being taught. And at these lynchings, lessons are being taught by people as well. So they understand when social faux pas do happen.
Okay, can you hear me? I'm curious, to have a panel of historians up here. I really would like to have your input on this curious trend today that we're passing all these laws to prevent the teaching of the history of race in our schools. And it's almost like what we're talking about today is illegal. We're not supposed to be doing it. So what is that about, and how do you as historians think about that? What's your reaction?
Really good question. Really good question. Critical race theory is under attack.
Well, it's not just critical race theory, but if you look at this, it's just black history. It's not just black history, it's just our history. They want everything to be peaceful and calm and happy, and everything was perfect, and our capitalist system was perfect. And it's just crazy to me that we would deny our children the opportunity to learn about their history. And I saw a thing the other day on Facebook of a little girl, a little elementary age student, black student, being escorted by FBI and other federal officials out of her apartment. She's going to school. She's got 4 of these people around her. And the comment was, if this little child can live it, surely we can read about it. where we can study it. It's outrageous. The guy in the state legislature here who is needing a special condemnation is Mark Lowry from Maumelle. He is the guy who has introduced in legislation like that in Arkansas. And it's a damnable piece of legislation, too.
Yeah, CRT is opponents even today, and there are fierce opponents out there. I'm talking fierce opponents, people that are willing to fight and die because of it. But a lot of the people would rather fight than to actually learn history. And I believe that it's more about what I think and what I feel than it is about actual history. We take Thomas Jefferson for an instance. Thomas Jefferson, our history says that Thomas Jefferson was very instrumental in the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And he's raised up on this high pedestal where he sits when we actually form an image in our mind of him. But Thomas Jefferson, he said I think he said he owned 100 slaves. And in my mind, it's kind of hard to imagine someone owning somebody. Who will I pay to own Tom? Who will I pay to own you?
I'll sell you, Tom.
Yeah.
Who gets the money? You know what I'm saying? So the whole thing is ridiculous. Thomas Jefferson he enslaved his own children. So I mean the ideology that he held that he said that he held in his mind and his heart could not have been true. Could not have been true. But we want to learn the true history of it. I want to know what's going on. How we came to be, how America came to be. What did we have to do to acquire this land? Because Columbus surely didn't discover this place in 1492. Especially with millions of people already here. It could not have happened. But this is the history that we have. And this is the history that we are teaching our children. And now the world is in wide open space. We're not confined to here to Malvern, Arkansas, or Arkansas in general. The whole world is open. And the whole world know our history. But we don't. Because our history is not taught.
I would say this, I am a trained historian. I spent 6 years freezing my behind off at The Ohio State University, learning how to be a trained historian. I've written a few books and more than a few articles. I'm a trained historian. My job is to teach history with evidence. It's not here for you to feel good about it all the time. A lot of it isn't going to feel good, but a lot of it will feel good because we are a great nation. We are not a perfect nation. We are a great nation, and there is a very distinct difference there. I teach critical thinking. I want you to think about how we got to where we are. It doesn't mean that you hate America. I don't hate America. I'm a war veteran, okay? I served my country, and I would do it again. But I'm also going to be very honest about what this nation is and what it isn't. And it's in the receipts. I'm not making this up. I'm not generating anything. All the documentation is there. And for us to bury our heads in the sand about that is the very denial of our history. And just so we're clear, once again, African American history is American history. Thank you.
I wanted to ask how important state history is as far as teaching state history in our classrooms as to, in connection with the teaching of our American history, and how we connect the dots. For example, when I was in school learning American history, I knew nothing really about our state history. And when I started learning for myself about our state history, Arkansas is rich in its history, but I began to connect the dots. It was almost like I could see it happening and unfolding, before my eyes, and how all of these things connected. And I think our young folks deserve, our students deserve to have their state history connect to American history. What is it in our state that they need to learn, as she was speaking about, NCRT and all of that? What is it in our state they need to learn about to connect to the world? And I think that's important. And how do you feel about that?
Well, I think if African American history is American history, Arkansas history is United States history. Growing up myself, we had, I want to say, a bare minimum of Arkansas history at the elementary school level, and that was it. And, our U.S. history books, if you're from Arkansas, you just don't see yourself reflected in there, except for a map about, the Confederacy, maybe. But, I think it's vitally important to connect our state to, the larger movement of American history, to connect, each of our individual towns to American history. You can teach American history by teaching the history of Malvern. You can talk about, the New South, new industry, timber coming in, railroads, resource exploitation, factories like the brick factory nearby. All of this speaks about the New South. And so if you're talking about late 19th, early 20th century American history, you can do that by teaching about the history of Malvern. I think it's vitally important that students connect their local place to larger America. Because, growing up in Jonesboro, Arkansas, I didn't see that connection. And if you don't see that connection, your local place, your hometown can almost become disposable because it doesn't become, a special place. And that's one thing I also think that we need to emphasize is that, what's important is not that a place has, the proudest, most noble story of its past, it's that it has any story at all. Stories make things special. A place is special if it has a story. People travel over to London to visit 221B Baker Street. Does anyone know what 221B Baker Street is? But the home of Sherlock Holmes. It's an address that doesn't exist, but people go over there to connect with those stories, to feel themselves a part of this place where this story took place. They also go to King's Cross Station for platform 7 3/4 or whatever. I read the books long ago. You all know what's there. It's where Harry Potter jumps off, onto the train to go to Hogwarts, right? And now they've installed official, exit there or whatever. But people go there to connect with those stories, and so any story makes a place more special. When I was growing up, I did not know about the Jonesboro Church Wars. Does anyone else here know about the Jonesboro Church Wars? Who isn't Tom? Yeah. But it was a conflict that erupted within a church. A revivalist came in. Half the congregation wanted the revivalist as their new preacher. The other half didn't. He went away. He came back the next year. It split the church. Then the two churches had this big fight over their church property. They started shooting each other in the streets. The governor had to call out the National Guard to restore order because these churches were having a literal war in the streets of Jonesboro. Had any of you heard of that before? You're in a trance now, aren't you? This is a great story, isn't it? It's a story I would have liked hearing growing up because, wow, that's just a bizarre piece of local history that, you may not be proud of the fact that, Baptists were going at it in the streets with guns, but, you can be proud to be in a place that has such a strange history. And I think it's important to connect, our local history with our state and national history and international history too.
In 1967, the Arkansas legislature passed a bill to require a semester of Arkansas history at the secondary level. It is more or less settled out at at the junior high level, often 7th, 8th, and 9th grades. We now do not have, in my opinion, an excuse to neglect Arkansas history anymore. We now have materials available. We have the University of Arkansas Press, which has produced so much that we have more than I can actually keep up with anymore. We have so many videos, for example, available through AETN. We don't have an excuse for not teaching Arkansas history anymore. I think the reason we don't do it is people who are in positions to make decisions don't value our history. I think that's what it gets down to, is they underestimate, they just don't see that it's that important. We have educational co-ops in this state, I don't know, 10 or 15 of them. Staffed, well-staffed, their work is to help schools and teachers and everything. Don't go to them and try to get them to do something on Arkansas history. They'll kick you out. If it isn't STEM, it doesn't exist anymore. I don't know what we're going to do with all these mathematicians running around. They don't know the city they live in. They don't know anything about their heritage. But we do a sorry job of teaching state and local history in this country. And as he said, we could teach American history using Arkansas examples exclusively. We even have a Revolutionary War battle, more or less, battle in Arkansas. It's a great resource, and we just don't take advantage of it. Arkansas history.
I quite agree. And as someone who was born and raised outside of this state, although I've lived here for 19 years, and God himself sent me a certificate in the mail that declared me an official Arkansan. I see stories that can be told all over the place. In fact, I didn't come here to write about Arkansas history. I became an Arkansas historian, and in particular, a historian of rural black women in Arkansas, because I saw stories everywhere. And when I was still teaching undergrads, I'm dean of the graduate school now, but when I was still teaching undergrads, I told students, if you're going to write a paper for me, find out what's going on in your own backyard. I have taught students from Elaine, Arkansas, who didn't know that there was a massacre there. I have taught students from Phillips County who didn't know that there were and still are black landowners there, and black cotton gin owners, and black business owners, and who never understood or knew Helena as a really happening place once upon a time, as was the case with a lot of these rural black towns. They don't know that history because no one has talked to them about that. And I would even say that as an outsider, I think sometimes there's even a bit of insecurity about being from Arkansas. But let me tell you from personal experience, Arkansas travels internationally. Arkansas travels internationally. I have been to England to talk about Arkansas. I have been to, where did I go? I went to Spain to talk about Arkansas. You don't know where I went. I went to Spain to talk about Arkansas. I gave a paper at a conference in Spain. Gave a paper about Arkansas in Paris, France. People want to know because they think they understand the South. But you can't generalize about what the South is. Arkansas is as different from South Carolina as it is from Georgia, North Carolina, so on and so forth. And when you start digging into those histories, you will wonder why you didn't do this work before. There is such rich and robust history in this state that has not yet been uncovered. I could be writing books and articles from now to the time I retire.
So who does the better barbecue?
Do you really want me to answer that? The South Carolina Low Country. Thank you.
We have another question here, folks.
Arkansas Act 1805, I believe it is, allows for inmate once convicted to serve out the full length of their sentence without the possibility of parole. When I worked at the prison, we called these backdoor-like sentences, as charges would be stacked up, and you'd have somebody doing minor time but serving over 50 years for something that's relatively small. Inmates are traded between facilities and while wearing white jumpsuits. The entire time, employees aren't allowed to bring in phones or any sort of recording devices, and it becomes immediately apparent the system is not designed to contain anyone, but to separate them from the general public, because the general public wouldn't stand for this. My question is, in a system that is designed to prevent the public from seeing the things that goes on within the prison system, how do you show them and communicate to them the atrocities? Thank you.
I think the question was, how can we educate the public about the atrocities happening behind closed doors?
I really don't know the answer to that. I think the best bet is probably some sort of program that would allow for prisoners themselves to communicate their own experiences through writing or whatever. There is increasing, a growing criticism of this sort of treatment. I think it was here recently, a man finally got out of prison. He robbed, if I remember this correctly, he robbed a convenience store in Fort Smith with an unloaded gun in 1970 something, and only just now got out of prison. That's an absolute failure. That if you're just from a pure budget conscious standpoint, where we've put more money into imprisoning that man, and then he ended up being transferred to Utah, of all places. Elderly man near the end of his life. I really don't connect with some of the people working in prison justice. That man back there, Kwame Abdul-Bey, who's currently standing up, may know someone in that area. He's working on it. Yeah, he's giving a thumbs up, so talk to him afterwards. But that's all I can really offer.
The penal system has been used, of course, forever to benefit the ruling class, if you can call it that. We had, after the Civil War, the South lost on the battlefield, but it won its objectives anyhow because it substituted the Jim Crow segregation and sharecropping and tenant farming and those sorts of things in lieu of slavery. And the penal system was a part of that. We had loitering laws. They were notorious. Police drive by, see some people sitting around talking, they'll just arrest them, send them to the, usually they're sent to the county penal farm, back in the days when we had them. An even more obvious example of using prisoners as a form of an extension of slavery was in leasing out our state penitentiary inmates. And that was done for probably 100 years. We only ended that in, about 1920, something like that, under George Donaghy. These people were just held as slaves, basically, under contract with a municipality. And it was pretty awful. Some of these people would end up being, they would leave the penal farms, then they'd be caught, and they'd be charged with more serious crimes. It was not a happy time, but the penal system was used as an extension of slavery. Now, what you're talking about in the current situation, and I need to step out, I guess, to get in touch with it. No, there he is. On the current situation, we've had a whole string of reformist governors, one after another, and none of them has been able to really fix our penal system in Arkansas. And we We're still spending a fortune on it. We're still building them just as rapidly as we can. And it's a huge drain upon us. And it's not far-fetched to associate it, at least, with slavery.
I'd like to say a big thank you to our panelists and also Dr. Washington, who's made his trip from Ohio today to be with us. If you wouldn't mind, please give our panelists a round of applause. At this time, panelists, you can return to your seats. We're going to move on to... I'm going to introduce Kwame Abdul-Bey. He's with Arkansas Peace and Justice Memorial. He is here to discuss the John Henry Harrison Memorial Marker. I'm also going to ask Melissa Phillips to come up to the stage. She is the president of the Hot Spring County Historical Society. Please welcome them both up now. Thank you. And I'm so sorry, I have to also introduce Mr. Lorne Abdul-Bey.
So he can see. First of all, I'm very honored and glad to be here today. I'm very happy that Hot Spring County is one of the several counties throughout the state that has started this journey through community remembrance projects. He's trying to get a picture. The Arkansas Peace and Justice Memorial Movement is an Arkansas affiliate of the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama. Who in here is familiar with the Equal Justice Initiative? Okay, who in here has been to Alabama to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, or we call it the Lynching Museum? Okay, so when you get an opportunity, you definitely need to do that visit and check out that site. Here in Arkansas, the Arkansas Peace and Justice Memorial Movement, our goal is to memorialize the documented 493 victims of extrajudicial racialized terror lynchings here in the state of Arkansas. 493 documented. When I say documented, I mean that we only probably are talking about a third of the actual lynchings. So 493, that makes Arkansas rank 4th in the number of lynchings that are documented. Arkansas is normally last in things, but we're 4th in lynchings. So what our goal is over the next 10 years is to go to each and every county and to set up memorial markers for those lynchings. And we're glad that we will be working here in Malvern to put up a memorial marker here. And we're working with you guys. We're not coming in to do it for you, just like you did this very excellent program here today that is an example that we can use for other counties, particularly with the exhibit in the back. That is very impressive. But this will be the 3rd, 4th memorial marker that will be erected here in Arkansas. There's one that was erected in Fayetteville last year, one that was erected in Little Rock last year. This year, we're going to do Malvern, and we're trying to work out the date for that because we really wanted to do it today, but things did not work out because of the COVID situation and everything. But what we need from the Hot Spring County community is basically we just need a minimum of 3 different entities that will agree to come together to do this. And in doing that, there's no cost in doing it. We just need the commitment from the community. Once we get the commitment from the community, then the Equal Justice Initiative foots the bill for striking the memorial, and we've already have funds for the actually putting the marker in place. And we normally like to put the marker in place at the site of the lynching. We try to get the permission from the current property owner to do that. If we aren't able to do that, then we get it as close to that site as possible. So, you guys, how do I get my information? Okay, you'll get my information. But I'll give it to Marion, and she has my information. You have my information? Yes, so whenever you guys are ready, what we just need to do is fill out the paperwork, and we need a 6-month lead time. And once we initiate that 6-month lead time with EJI, then EJI will get it struck. They will ship it, no cost, to wherever we need to ship it to, and then we just need to create the program, the ceremony to actually do that. And after we do that, then we'll have it erected, and then we'll be number 4, number 5 as far as the memorial markers are concerned. At the same time, we talked about legislation and public policy. We are at the same time working with the legislature and the governor's office, trying our best to actually get legislation to create a statewide commission that would be able to deal with difficult history here in the state of Arkansas. Because, as it was stated earlier, this does need to be taught, and it needs to be taught from the standpoint that this is history. We don't have to label it Arkansas history, Black history. We don't have to label it American history. It's history. History is something that happened in the past from which we can learn here in the present, and it will help us to navigate our future. So I thank you guys for really helping out with this, and all I need to know is, what do you need from us?
The Hot Spring County Historical Society Board met, and we are on board to help in any way that we are needed, whether it's paperwork or helping fund or anything that is needed of us. We're there to support this effort. And I thank you for coming today. And I also wanted to thank all the people that are here, because history is something that needs to be taught, the good history and the bad history, so that we can remember the good history and never repeat the bad history. And you being here tells me and the others here that you're interested in history, and so we have a place for you to come. And I'm inviting you now, as a president of the Historical Society here in Hot Spring County, come to our meetings. We have wonderful research materials available for you, and we would love for you to join our Historical Society and be part of collecting and preserving and sharing the history of our county, because this history is our history. We've inherited part of it, and we're creating the rest of it.
And so please do think about coming to join us. Our next meeting is this coming Monday night at 7 o'clock at the Heritage House, which is at 118 West 2nd Street. And please do come if you are interested in history. I know you will be welcomed. And as we leave today, reflect on what you've learned today, the information, and take it with you. And also, as you do that, be kinder to everyone that is expected. Be more kind than what is expected. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kwame. Thank you, Melissa. All right, as we wrap up our day, I know Melissa mentioned reflecting. You do have your evaluation forms in your packets. So if you would not mind filling those out, that'd be really wonderful. You can leave them on the back table. We do have one more. Pastor Troy Conrad is going to come up. He's going to discuss next steps and his booklet, Having the Conversation. So if you, Pastor Troy Conrad from First United Methodist Church, please welcome him up.
Hi everyone, I'm Pastor Troy, and I just want to tell you that I stand among giants today. Thank you all for your presentation. It's been very informative, and it's helped us, I think all of us, to learn about the sin of racism. One of the reasons why I want to come and talk today, and one of the reasons I was invited, is to talk about our future. We've talked a lot about our history, but also I think it's important that history teaches us about our future. Now, in our history, we have learned about an orderly mob. Now, I can probably tell you that for some of those orderly mobs on Friday, they turned out to be Sunday's quiet deacons. And in our churches, we have ignored the sin of racism for far too long. And it's time for us to start taking a stand. Especially in our white churches where this has been regulated to our fellowship halls and our back rooms, and we just don't talk about it anymore. And so our Arkansas Conference has created a resource for you. You should have gotten it as a part of your packet, is Having the Conversation. And it is just honestly having a conversation. And as we were developing this resource, trying to figure out how we can effectively talk to each other, how we can find stories that we can share with each other and common bonds that would help draw us together, one of the things that we discovered is that God had already been there. So this Bible study is a 6-week study through the book of Acts. And we found out that whenever we started talking about racism, we talked about how God has helped people, we found out stories like Nathan and the Ethiopian. We found out stories like Rhoda, who did not have a voice, and yet God gave her a voice. We found stories like Timothy, who was the son of a mixed marriage. And all of these things have come together for us to realize that God has already got a plan for us here in Malvern, and that plan is acceptance and love and lifting each other up. And as we look to the future, I think it's important for us to lay this foundation of moral and ethical responsibility that should start in our churches. I invite you all to take this resource back with you to your churches. You don't have to be a pastor to lead this. I promise you. I've led this a dozen times, and it's been absolutely amazing each and every time. And as we go forth into the future, today we've looked at the horrors of the past so that we can have a hope for the future. Thank you.
Pastor Troy. I hope you've all had an interesting day here and learned a lot. Please remember to leave those evaluation forms for us on the back table. I also want to mention that all of our committee members, contributors, and panelists, there is a small token of appreciation on the back table. Please, it's got your name on it. If you wouldn't mind picking that up on your way out. I've really enjoyed being here. I hope the conversation continues, and just glad to be a part. So, in closing, thank you all.